hear that lonesome Southern Pacific 6 chime or Hancock 3 chime on the Southern Pacific Railroad's most famous steam locomotive, you know that is the sound of the daylight. Southern Pacific 4449 is America's steamer for many reasons. She is the most well-known steam locomotive for the American Freedom Train. She has also appeared in many movies and TV shows, and she is also the most popular steam locomotive in the United States. 4449 has had an illustrious service life from the time she was built in 1941 by the Lima Locomotive Works to now. You are watching Southern Pacific 4449, Pride of America. May 20th, 1941, the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. This beautiful GS4 for the Southern Pacific Railroad was built, and she was one of the last steam locomotives for the new GS4 class. She rolled out of the factory in Ohio and was attached on a freight train for the Golden State of California. That is what the GS in this new class of locomotives was called, Golden State. The name would later be swapped for general service. On May 30th, 1941, she was put into service on the most beautiful train in the world, the Coast Daylight Passenger Train running between Los Angeles and San Francisco. The 4449 has a length of 110 feet, a width of 10 feet, and a height of 16 feet. She is a big one, as the tender weighed 313,730 pounds and the engine weighed 475,000 pounds for a total weight of 788,730 pounds. The engine is also an oil burner, as the Southern Pacific liked oil burners so they would not catch dry brush and forest on fire as coal or wood does. The engine for its whole life ran on the Southern Pacific Railroad's daylight passenger trains. This included the Shasta Daylight, San Joaquin Daylight, Sacramento Daylight, and especially the Coast Daylight. The engine has a whistle and an air horn, a Hancock 3 chime, and a Leslie A200 nicknamed the Foghorn. For all of the locomotive's life, she served the western United States in Southern California, the Southwest, or even in the dense forests of Northern California and Southern Oregon. But her jobs were always the prestigious daylight passenger trains. The 4449 operated for the longest time in her iconic Southern Pacific daylight colors in red, orange, and black for their passenger trains. These colors were chosen by Charles Eccleston, a designer for the Southern Pacific Railroad. In the late 1940s, a second batch of GS4s and a new class of GS5s had arrived from the Lima Locomotive Works. As such, 4449 was assigned to the Golden State route in the Southwest and the Sunset route in Texas and Louisiana. By the 1950s, she was reassigned to the Coast Division in the Bay Area, along with more southern areas like San Jose, Watsonville, and San Francisco. She was also regulated to secondary Southern Pacific passenger trains, none of which were as glamorous as her original assignments. But for the first 10 years of her life, she had an illustrious service life, including a very special event. On October 17, 1954, 4449 and her sister, 4447, hauled a 10-car passenger train for the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society of Los Angeles to Oweno, California and back again. In 1955, 4449 was one of the last GS4s and daylight engines in the red, orange, and black paint scheme. But her time and her iconic daylight colors wouldn't last much longer, as she was repainted to black and silver like most of her siblings after dieselization came to the Southern Pacific in the mid-1950s. Along with that, her skirts were also removed. The 4449 was then assigned to the San Joaquin Valley area in Bakersfield and Fresno to pull freight and passenger trains. She occasionally did haul the San Joaquin daylight, but her days of running between San Francisco and Los Angeles were long gone, as she was regulated to helper service and fast freights. On September 24, 1956, 4449 was semi-retired from service, indicating the beginning of the end. She wasn't fully retired because she was still an option for emergency jobs like a helper or when another train broke down, but she was no longer hauling regular trains for the SP. However, 4449's fate was sealed as on October 2, 1957, she was fully retired from service and placed in storage at the SP's Bakersfield Roundhouse, 111 miles north of Los Angeles.
By 1958, while most of the GS2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s were being scrapped, 4449, still in her black and silver paint scheme, was moved from storage in Bakersfield and hauled to Portland, Oregon, where she was donated on April 24, 1958. She was placed in Oaks Park, exposed to the outside elements. While on display at the park, the engine was a victim of vandalism and had its builder's plate, original whistle, among many other pieces of the locomotive removed. As a result, the engine quickly deteriorated. The rainy weather in Portland did not help matters. However, a man named Jack Holst, a former employee of the Southern Pacific Railroad, made sure the locomotive's bearings and rods were oiled just in case the engine ever turned a wheel. Holst also looked after two other steam locomotives in Oaks Park, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700, and Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company 197. Thanks to the efforts of Holst, the engines were in a condition where they could be moved out of Oaks Park at any point. Unfortunately, Mr. Holst passed away in 1972 and never got to see the trio turn a wheel again. However, his actions would play a much bigger role in the future of these engines. In the early 1970s, Ross Rowland, a young and successful New York broker, along with an occasional steam locomotive engineer, had an idea. He wanted to have a train go across the contiguous 48 states to celebrate the 200th birthday of the United States. America had a centennial before. The 1876 Philadelphia Exposition was a grand celebration for the 100th birthday of America. However, amid the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, there was no plan for a 200th birthday. Ross Rowland wanted to change that. He met up with his friends and knew from past experiences that this kind of celebration can happen. The 1969 Golden Spike celebration featuring Nickel Plate Road 759 was proof. Rowan, knowing that this was possible, began working on the project in 1971. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get very much publicity and lack of sponsors didn't help. Many who heard of Rowan's attempts didn't believe that it was possible to have steam locomotives haul a bicentennial train across the U.S. But he persisted and eventually caught a break in 1973 when he met Ralph Weisinger. Ralph was a close friend of Pepsi's chairman, Don Kendall. After a meeting between Rowan, Weisinger, and Kendall, Pepsi's chairman liked the idea of the train and granted $1 million as a sponsor for the American Freedom Train Foundation. Pepsi's backing of the Freedom Train made the news, and Rowan found himself more sponsorships coming his way with companies like Kraft, General Motors, and various other companies sponsoring the train, and now had a lot of the money issue solved with all these sponsors. When President Richard Nixon heard about this project, he gave Rowan access to the National Archives with objects that were a big part of America's history put on the train, like the Liberty Bell, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and many more. More than 500 artifacts were put on the train. With money, equipment, and now approval from the federal government solved, all that was left was to pick a locomotive. But that was easier said than done, as Rowan and his crew need a big and powerful locomotive like a 484 or even bigger. Anything smaller like a Mikado Consolidation or a Mountain was too small for the train. While others were scouting to find the appropriate locomotive for the train, Rowan found out about 4449 in Oaks Park. After traveling to Portland, his team inspected the locomotive. After looking the engine over, they found that the bearings, side rods, and much of the internal boiler of the engine were in good shape thanks to Jack Holst. The locomotive was also the right size for the weight and distance of the train. Furthermore, the engine also had iconic Southern Pacific skirts that could fit with a lot of paint schemes. As such, the engine was then chosen for the American Freedom Train.
On December 13th, 1974, 4449 was towed out of Oaks Park for her brand new life. She was subsequently taken to the Burlington Northern Hoyt Street Roundhouse in Portland. For the next 3.5 months, the locomotive was inspected and rebuilt by Ross Rowland and his team.
The engine would have to be more thoroughly prepared than the Reading engine had been. The Daylight was planned to pull the train continuously for over 11 months, with little time for servicing along the route, even if facilities could be found.
After many months of work by Ross Rowland and his team, Southern Pacific 4449 was fully restored and ready for operation in a brand new red, white, and blue scheme to match the consist of the American Freedom Train. Since the original whistle had been taken off of the engine, 2 new replacements were brought in and fitted to the engine, a Hancock 3 chime from SP&S 700 and a Southern Pacific 6 chime. Thankfully, the engine's air horn was not stolen, but before she could head to Chicago, she needed to perform some tests. To make sure that she was in great order to haul the American Freedom Train for over 11,000 miles, she needed to haul the weight needed for the train. Freight cars equal to the weight of the American Freedom Train were lashed to the back of the locomotive, and she performed tests near Wishram, Washington, over the mountains and valleys. After many months of tests, 4449 was deemed a great fit and ready for the American Freedom Train. The day before her journey would start, she headed to Swan Island near Portland, Oregon as a public display for the day as Reading T1 number 2101 continued the American Freedom Train in the east. 4449 then headed to Chicago, making stops in Sacramento and Ogden, Utah for overnight servicing. But shenanigans were in store for the engine. Near Dorchester, Nebraska on June 30th, 1975, a dump truck backed up near a construction site onto the train tracks. The driver tried to get out of the way, but the engine clipped the back of the truck. Nobody was hurt, but 4449 needed a new metal skirt to replace the chipped section. As such, 4449 went to GM's plant in LaGrange, Illinois for the replacement. Finally, the engine arrived in Chicago on July 27th. That day, she met up with the other restored steamer, Reading T1 number 2101. The T1 swapped the Freedom Train after taking it all across the eastern states. 2101 also went into Chicago needing repairs after being restored a mere 30 days when Rowland bought the engine earlier that year from a scrapyard. 4449 took the train to Crystal Lake, Illinois and went all over the western United States. On September 23, 1975, the engine went in for repairs at the Union Pacific Railroad's Omaha, Nebraska shops to fix the drivers. This caused the engine to miss dates in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, with Burlington Northern diesels used for the dates. After that, 4449 took off for the Pacific Northwest. After the AFT headed for Seattle and then south toward Oregon and California, the 4449 swapped the Freedom Train in Austin, Texas for Texas and Pacific number 610, another steamer restored for the event. 610 was restored by a good friend of Rowland, David Pearson. 4449 headed to the Southern Railway shops in Irondale, Alabama before getting the train back from Texas and Pacific 610 in Dallas. 4449 then took the train across Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Alabama. She swapped the train again in Birmingham as 2101 took the train. By late summer of 1976, the majority of the hype for the American Freedom Train was burning out, but the show had to go on as the 4449 was about to finish in the eastern United States. 4449 and 2101 swapped the train for the last time in Washington, D.C. as 4449 took the train through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and finally Florida. On December 31st, 1976, 4449 made her last stop in Miami, Florida. A closing ceremony was held with 3 million attending and a party all-night vibe to the final night of the American Freedom Train. By the morning of 1977, the end came and went, and the AFT was complete.
The 4449 was then placed into storage in Miami. All the artifacts on the train were taken back to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. The passenger cars were later sold to Canada for their discovery train that year. The 4449 sat in a shed in Miami for only a few weeks until she took on a new job. Amtrak, formed on May 1st, 1971, created a special train called the Amtrak Transcontinental Steam Excursion, with 4449 being the main locomotive to haul the train from Miami along the Sunset Route and up to Portland, Oregon to her home. The original plan was to take the train north towards Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, but the opportunity to go along the California coast with more people attending proved too much to pass on. As such, the route went all along the same Sunset Route and turned north toward Los Angeles and up along the coast before going inland in the Sacramento River Valley and Mount Shasta through the Cascades before ending in Portland. The event was a spin-off to the American Freedom Train to promote the railroad, but also to get 4449 back to Portland, Oregon, as she was due for repairs after traveling across the United States for 2 years. Shortly after, 4449 was steamed up once again in Miami and took charge of the journey from Miami on January 14, 1977. $9,700 people bought tickets to ride behind 4449. She left Miami and went to Sanford, Thomasville, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama, where 4449 spent the winter in the Southern Railway shops in Irondale, Alabama, outside of Birmingham. The train then continued along the Sunset Route of Jackson, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana. For the rest of 1977, the engine ran along the southwest, making stops in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Southern California before heading north toward Sacramento and Redding, stopping in San Luis Obispo, Oakland, Dunsmuir, and Eugene. Finally, on May 1st, 1977, 4449 ended her journey in Portland, Oregon, 2 years after leaving for the American Freedom Train.
After the engine sat at Portland Union Station overnight, the locomotive did not go back to the Hoyt Street Roundhouse. Instead, Brooklyn Roundhouse, owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad, was used to store the 4449. The railroad leased the roundhouse to the now formed Friends of 4449. The engine and the group had a temporary but long-term home. 4449 was due for some major repairs because of the mileage that she had accumulated over the US from 1975 to 1977. For the rest of the 1970s, 4449 was dormant. However, in 1981, 4449 awoke from her slumber and she was fired up for a very special event. The California State Railroad Museum in Old Sacramento was fully constructed after years of planning and proposals to the state. Several steam locomotives were slated to come for the opening of this brand new museum in Old Sacramento. These locomotives included Southern Pacific 1269, Union Pacific 8444 and 3985, Dardanelle and Russellville No. 8, and 4449. During her time at the Brooklyn Roundhouse, she was returned to her original daylight livery with a new change. The engine now had big Southern Pacific lettering on the tender of the locomotive. She originally had this paint job after she was repainted sometime in the 1940s. Another change was that the Southern Pacific 6 chime mounted on the locomotive earlier became the permanent and only whistle on the locomotive. The Hancock 3 chime was returned to SP&S 700. 4449 was fired up in Portland and went down to Sacramento for the opening of the California State Railroad Museum. From May 2nd to May 10th, the party rang loud and clear with thousands traveling to Sacramento for the celebration. On May 11th, all engines steamed back to Nevada for Dardanelle and Russellville No. 8, Wyoming for 8444 and 3985, and Oregon for 4449. After that, 4449 returned to the Brooklyn Roundhouse and underwent some maintenance. However, in 1984, 4449 would travel along familiar rails. The New Orleans World's Fair was being held, with UP 8444 and 4449 asked to take part in the fair. 8444 came from Cheyenne down south, and 4449 followed the Cascades route in Northern California and Southern Oregon down through Sacramento, inland to Fresno and Bakersfield before turning in Southern California and heading on the Sunset route through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. arriving in May, breaking the world record for the longest passenger steam excursion in the history of the United States. The locomotive stayed in New Orleans next to the NASA Space Shuttle Enterprise and the monorail ride, and she was also open to the public. After only a week arriving in New Orleans, the locomotive headed across the Mississippi River for the second time to Portland. 8444 would stay throughout the whole fair, returning home in December of that year. Two years later, in 1986, preparations were being made to the 4449. This was in anticipation for her first time on the big screen.
In March, the Disney Studios in Los Angeles reached an agreement with the city of Portland to use the daylight in a major motion picture. This required servicing the engine and preparing a special train for a trip to Hollywood.
Walt Disney was filming Tough Guys featuring Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster. The premise of the movie is about two criminals who want to rob the same train that they tried last time and got 30 years in jail. The two were getting old and they wanted to try one more time and escape to Mexico in the process. The 4449 was the lucky engine to be picked in the movie, and the train in the movie was christened as the Gold Coast Flyer, run in the movie by the Southern Pacific Railroad.
What's that? Souvenir.
The 4449 was chosen for the effect of luxury. Disney had previously looked at Union Pacific 8444 to run the train with a matching set of Union Pacific passenger cars. Unfortunately, the logistics of trying to get 8444 from Cheyenne to Los Angeles proved a little too hard. Eventually, Disney found 4449 and chose the locomotive to be in the movie. The locomotive traveled from Portland to Los Angeles and filming commenced. Most of the scenes with 4449 were filmed on the Kaiser Steel ore rail line called the Eagle Mountain Railroad that almost ran to Mexico. From March 31st to April 11th, the locomotive was filmed in Los Angeles, El Monte, and Taylor Yard. She was first filmed in Taylor Yard.
Piece of cake.
What's the trouble, officer?
The train's being robbed.
You're crazy. Nobody robs trains anymore. I'd say you've been misinformed.
At the end, she was filmed for the iconic chase scene at the Eagle Mountain Railroad. Doyle McCormick was a character on set, acting as the engineer for the Gold Coast Flyer. He also helped with 4449's restoration back in 1974 and 1975. After filming, 4449 left SoCal and went north to Portland. After returning home from Portland, the locomotive did a number of small excursions but never went on a big mainline run. However, in 1989, she headed back to SoCal for the second time for a big celebration. Los Angeles Union Station near downtown Los Angeles was turning 50 years old, serving the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, and Santa Fe when they previously operated their passenger trains at that same station. UP 8444 and 4449 were invited to celebrate the occasion. The locomotives also participated in a once-in-a-lifetime event. They raced along El Cajon Pass on parallel tracks. The two engines departed Los Angeles and raced along the mountain crest. 8444 was on the lower track while 4449 had a smaller train but a much steeper grade at 2.5 to 3%. 8444 had the edge for most of the race until 4449 had a hotbox and was forced to stop and continue at a much slower pace. whole event was captured on video and was one of 4449's most memorable moments. After the event in mid-May, the locomotive went back to Portland and a new decade began.
Just a year after the success of Tough Guys, 4449 was cast into a new Tinseltown film, Come See the Paradise, which took place during World War II. For the effects of the film, the engine was weathered black to look like a coal-burning steamer and was filmed in Portland just for the locomotive departing the station. She wasn't in a huge role like in Tough Guys, but it was another impressive add-in for the locomotive history. Just a year later, 4449 was invited to Sacramento again to take part in Railfair 91, along with the renumbered UP-844 and the newly restored Southern Pacific 2472 for the California State Railroad Museum's 10th birthday. Once again, she went south toward the Golden State Capitol along the Cascade Mountains. After arriving, she stayed in Old Sac for several days along with Union Pacific 3985, John Bull, Virginia and Truckee 22, Union Pacific 1243, Southern Pacific 1233, and many more. The 4449 and all of the others stayed from May 3rd to the 12th. After the festival ended, all the engines went home. However, just a year later, the locomotive came right back to California. This time, it was for the National Railroad Historical Society convention in San Jose, California. Many steamers that 4449 had already met were featured at the convention, like UP 3985 and SP 2472. Though not as memorable as her trips to New Orleans and Los Angeles, it was still a memorable trip for the locomotive. After the convention, the locomotive went back to smaller excursion trains in and around Portland. That was until 1999. For the third time in the engine's history, 4449 loaded up with oil and water, then went down south to Sacramento for Railfare 99. On her way through, she would stop at the newly re-established McLeod Railroad at Transfer Yards. There, McLeod 25 met the locomotive for the first time. You might know McLeod 25 from Stand By Me. After McLeod, 4449 continued through Redding and Red Bluff before arriving in Sacramento. Between June 18th and 27th, 4449 and various other locomotives stayed at the California State Railroad Museum for another get-together. The usuals were back, like UP 844 and 3985, but there were some newly restored steamers on the block that included Santa Fe 3751, Sumter Valley 3, Southern Pacific 2467, Sandstone Crag, and Thomas? Yep, from the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the museum gave Thomas for the kids to ride on. The festival was a huge success, and after June 27th, all of the steamers headed home. However, 844 had to be towed back to Cheyenne. This is because while she was at the museum, she blew a boiler tube while on display. As such, she had to be coupled behind diesel locomotives and towed back to Wyoming. 3985 did not suffer a boiler tube explosion, but she did have some mechanical difficulties that resulted in her also being towed back from California to Cheyenne. After coming home from Sacramento, starting on the 29th and ending on July 1st, she went back to the Brooklyn Street Roundhouse, where she spent the rest of the year silent with Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700, participating in excursion trains from Portland to Beaverton and Hillsborough. As the 1990s ended, 4449 would return in a familiar livery in the new Millennium.
In 2000, Burlington Northern Santa Fe was operating the BNSF Employee Appreciation Special Train. They were taking the train all across their system, and 4449 was asked to take part in BNSF's Pacific Northwest. To avoid the appearance of the SP, the locomotive was repainted black in a scheme that matched her original black and silver paint job when she was regulated to secondary Southern Pacific passenger trains, freights, and helper service. She also had BNSF logos on her skirts and tender. In July of 2000, the locomotive left the roundhouse and went all over the Pacific Northwest of BNSF like Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. After 4449's stint on the BNSF train, other locomotives like Frisco 1522 hauled the train all over BNSF's system. In 2001, 4449, still in her BNSF livery, she pulled heavy excursion trains between Portland and Washington State. But in 2002, she was repainted once again, this time in a familiar paint job to honor a certain event in American history.
A plane just what? The 737?
It what?
The World Trade Center.
Who are you talking to?
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
A new type of war. That's what it is.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Although the American Freedom Train was discontinued in 1977, 4449 was repainted to honor the victims of 9/11. Starting in March of 2002, the locomotive made various excursions in and around Oregon with many photo run-bys. Although many rail fans were happy to see 4449 back in her original American Freedom Train colors, it wasn't for the reason that everyone wanted. In 2004, 4449 was repainted into her as-delivered paint scheme with small Southern Pacific lines lettering at the top of her tender. Later that fall in 2004, she took part in an incredible excursion train from Portland to Billings, Montana. With permission from BNSF and organized by the Friends of 4449, she was to travel through eastern Oregon, north toward Washington and Pasco along with Spokane, then continuing through Washington into Sandpoint, Idaho, and then continuing into Montana with stops in Helena, Bozeman, Missoula, Livingston, and finally ending in Billings. The 17-car passenger train and single diesel locomotive for braking left Portland on October 7th for Big Sky Country. She arrived in Billings on the 12th and sat on display for the public to see. Later on the 15th, she went back to Portland, Oregon in what was one of her longest excursion journeys that she had done since the 1984 World's Fair, with 2,050 miles to her name for the journey. In 2005 and 2006 were down years for the 4449, with a couple photo ops and the Holiday Express excursion trains in Oaks Park. In 2007, though, she would meet a familiar face. Union Pacific 844 was participating in the Puget Sound doubleheader between Portland and Everett, Washington. With permission from the Union Pacific Railroad, the two famous steamers and an 18-car train left Portland on May 12, 2007.
We're normally running freight, so they're getting kind of pinched for this to come out. You know, if they're rested, ready to go, then they're, yeah, come on.
Going north into Washington and then continuing east toward Olympia and Tacoma, passing through Seattle before ending in Everett. In Everett, the two sat on display for 3 days. On May 22nd, the two then double-headed the train back to Portland. After arriving back, 844 headed south and then east towards Cheyenne, while 4449 went back to the Brooklyn Roundhouse.
In 2008 was another down year for the 4449. There were no big excursions, just the Holiday Express and occasional repairs to the locomotive. 2009 was memorable for the locomotive because she undertook a journey that could rival the AFT. On March 24, 2009, it was announced that the Steam Festival was taking place in Owasso, Michigan. Along with that, 4449 will be attending the festival. While exciting, getting the locomotive to Michigan, a distance greater than her original journey to Chicago for the AFT, was easier said than done with 10 states to pass through. The 2,500-mile journey was planned by the Friends of 4449, Friends of 261, Amtrak, and the Steam Railroading Institute of Owasso. To have enough people on the train, Friends of 261 shipped some of their Milwaukee Road passenger cars to help get as many people as possible onto the train. On July 2nd, the locomotive left the Brooklyn Roundhouse to Portland Union Station to stay overnight. Early the next morning, passengers got on board the 12-car train. Passing through Big Sky Country, 4449 ran over the rails that she was supposed to in the 1970s for the American Freedom Train. She also passed through the biggest communities in North Dakota, Montana, and other states.
traveling for 17 days, the locomotive finally arrived in Owasso, Michigan. She met some of Lima's other graduates like Pure Marquette 1225 and Nickel Plate Road 765. Others were Little River Railroad number 110, Flag Coal Company number 75, Viscose Company number 6, and a replica of the Levitan. For several days, the locomotives were hustling excursion trains in and out of Owasso. The locomotives also sat on display for the public to see when night fell. However, on July 31st, it was time for 4449 to head back, leaving Owasso for Michigan City, then Chicago, then heading east toward Portland. After traveling through 10 states, 5,000 miles of travel, and going through some snow and ice in North Dakota, the locomotive finally arrived back from an overnight stay in Spokane to Portland. Her trip topping records for one of the longest trips she had ever taken, finishing off the year with the annual Holiday Express. However, in 2009, the Brooklyn Roundhouse started to show its age. Roof leaks, cracked wooden floors, very smelly and very dirty. The Roundhouse was nearing 100 years old and always needed attention to keep the space in a work-friendly environment. Plus, the Roundhouse was not welcome to the public and many members wanted the place to become public as that would provide a great economic opportunity for visitors to come and also donate. During that time too, the Union Pacific Railroad, which now owned the property after the Southern Pacific was merged, wanted to expand the yard to make more room. Eventually, the Friends of 4449, SP&S 700, and ORNN number 197 began drawing up plans for a new permanent home in downtown Portland. The Union Pacific Railroad eventually learned about their plans, and after a discussion with the City of Portland and the UP, the Oregon Rail Heritage Center was drawn up and was to be opened by 2012 with the Brooklyn Roundhouse scheduled for demolition later that year. Thankfully, the Union Pacific was very accepting to the trio and gave them plenty of time to move it all out. In 2011, 4449 was seen at Portland Union Station for National Train Day. The locomotive would also make another mainline run, but just between two states. The locomotive took an excursion train from Portland to Tacoma, Washington on June 25th. That same year, planning for the brand new Oregon Rail Heritage Center finally broke ground and construction began. Later that same year in July, she hauled 2 more excursions between Portland and Wish-Ram, Washington between July 2nd and July 3rd. In 2012, the 3 locomotives were moved from their longtime home to their new home next to the Oregon Museum of Science and History on June 26th.
Pretty impressive.
2012 also saw 4449 make a run to Bend, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington. These 2 excursions would be her last mainline runs for her, as her 1,472-day inspection test was looming. On July 28th, the engine house, though not fully completed, was fully enclosed and the 3 moved into their new permanent home. The passenger cars, auxiliary tender, and other pieces of rolling stock were kept outside in the new rail yard. The Brooklyn Roundhouse started demolition in August when the sides of the building were removed. Then the building was completely demolished in September of that year with everything but a few items saved. The items saved would be the original roundhouse doors and also the turntable, which was removed right before demolition had begun. Thankfully, both items are now proudly at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center, with the doors of the original roundhouse acting as the front doors for the steam locomotives and the roundhouse turntable awaiting a permit from the City of Portland to be used on the Oregon Rail Heritage Center. Finally, On September 22, 2012, the brand new Oregon Rail Heritage Center was open to the public with Southern Pacific 4449, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700, and Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company 197 available for viewing. 4449 wrapped up her 40 years of excursion service with the Holiday Express in Oaks Park. Although the three now had a permanent home, 4449 now had to be inspected and restored to return to the main line. Between 2013 and 2015, the locomotive was restored with a group of volunteers from the Friends of 4449 and many others. After boiler tests, fuel replacements, and an inspection from the FRA, Southern Pacific 4449 was given the green light to hustle excursion trains for another 15 years of service in 2015. A year later, the locomotive made her grand re-entrance with an excursion train in Oaks Park for the Holiday Express. In June 2017, the locomotive made her grand re-entrance to the main line with an excursion train from Portland to Bend, Oregon. In December of that year, she pulled the Holiday Express. In 2018, the locomotive made a different appearance. Laro Productions chartered 4449 for the day in October with a matching consist to go around the yard for the day and night. That December, she pulled the Holiday Express. In 2019, she made trips along the Willamette River for the National Garden Railway Convention near Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge on the Oregon Pacific Railroad. "4449 finished off 2019 with the Holiday Express in what was the last normal excursion for the locomotive in a long time. You all know what.
Tonight I want to speak with you about our nation's unprecedented response to the coronavirus outbreak that started in China and is now spreading throughout the world. Today, the World Health Organization officially announced that this is a global pandemic.
4449 was supposed to take part in the Holiday Express, but all events were canceled because of coronavirus. However, once COVID does clear up, 4449 will return to the main line with excursions on the Oregon Pacific Railroad and also on the main line of America.
Southern Pacific 4449 has had a really crazy journey. She started like every other steam locomotive in America, except for her status and job. She was downgraded, then retired, vandalized until one man kept her in good condition. She was tasked to pull the American Freedom Train all across the western United States, then had a beautiful second career hauling train enthusiasts and normal people alike, traveling to many more states and bringing a smile to anyone's face when she roars by. But why is she so beloved? Looked asked many train YouTubers why, and they all said mostly the same thing. Her design and history are what made her famous. It is why many people, including the two of us, say that she is the most famous steamer in the United States. Southern Pacific 4449 is a steamer that is not going away anytime soon. She is the pride of America.